500 years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck. And upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, "I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die."
G'day, this is X-Band, the Phantom Podcast. Our website is chroniclechamber.com, and you can subscribe to our podcast via YouTube or through your favourite podcast apps. Do not forget to give us a rating on your podcast app and tell a mate about us. In this episode, we are following up on episode 101, where we discussed Robert Aman's book about the Phantom's political leaning. Now, 100 odd podcasts later, we thought we'll get Robert on again, and that is mainly because he has released a new book which is titled When the Phantom Becomes a Swede. Yes, the Phantom is a Swede. I thought that might get a few people upset and is definitely worthy of a podcast, so I thought let's get him on. Now, as this book has not been released in English, our Swedish friend and correspondent, Mikael Lyck, has read it cover to cover, and he will be heading up this podcast grilling Robert. Welcome, Mikael. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Now, you've got the book next to you, I believe.
Yeah, it's right here.
Full of post-it notes and stuff like that, is it?
No, it's all here. It's all here.
Now, I believe that book is signed. Is that right, Mikael?
Yeah, I got it signed at when I met Robert in the comic fair in Stockholm.
Awesome. Now, for our Patreon listeners, we are going to be giving away that signed book for our Christmas giveaway. So in probably a couple of weeks' time, we will do a raffle for that, the signed book by Robert. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us, Mikael. I hope you enjoyed tonight as well.
I will.
Now, as you have probably realised, I'm the only Aussie in this conversation. To be honest, Dan, he's got some exams and stuff that he has to prepare for with his kids, but also with his own work as well. And Stephen, there's a state of emergency where they are with some floods and stuff like that as well. So he's quite busy. Last time we spoke to him was actually sandbagging the comic book shop. And as we all know, we need our comics in a time of this, so he is doing that as well. Robert has given us a list of Phantom stories that he used and referenced in this book. Now, we have included it in our show notes, and we've also even created an article before this podcast has gone out to let people know about what stories to read in preparation for today's podcast. So hopefully you've had a chance to read those stories, or you'll have a bit of a look at the list and then you'll go from there as you listen to this as well. So, Robert, how are you? And welcome.
I'm fine, thank you, and I'm I feel very honored to be back on the show. I'm an avid listener as well, so it feels great to be back.
No, right. Well, it's good to hear that at least there's another person listening. It's always encouraging when we find someone or someone says, "Oh, listen to your podcast." It's like, yes. So thank you for that.
And also, you kept the conversation going since our last discussion, because you've had people like Ulf Granberg on and Magnus Knutsson and so on and so forth, and they've in various ways mentioned or discussed some of the issues that I bring up in this book that you introduced earlier.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing since we've had you on back in episode 101 is Frew have started publishing a lot of the stories that we talked about in that podcast as well. The slaves, the Dead River, and
the trade war.
The trade war, yeah.
Yeah, they did, yeah.
So let's let's take the glory and say that they were all published because of our podcast back then. So hopefully some of these other stories that we're going to be discussing and that are in our show notes, Free will also publish as well, because they'll listen to it and go, oh, wow, we have to publish those. And a shout out and a hello to Dudley and Glenn who are listening to this.
Yeah, and if you are, please contact me and I'll help you out with contextualizing those episodes that you did in the ones that you already published. I saw that my work was referenced, which made me very happy.
Awesome. And we'll have links to how to contact you in the article and the show notes as well. So now, if you've been living under a rock, I'm Australian. I haven't read all the stories. I haven't read the book because, I can't read Swedish. So Mikael is going to be taking the reins and the lead of this podcast. Are you nervous, Mikael?
A bit. It's not my usual thing, but yeah, I'll try.
Shouldn't I be the one who's nervous? I'm the one who has to answer all these tricky questions. And this is a conversation that Mikael initiated when we were tabling next to each other at Stockholm International Comics Festival.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about that, guys.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting with the Scandinavian chapter of the Lee Falk Memorial Bengalis Explorers Club, trying to get some new members, and yeah, we were placed next to Robert, which was great, of course, since we both have a Phantom connection, and we had quite a lot of time to talk about the book, since that was actually when I was reading it, and a lot of good discussions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's always lovely to be able to speak about the Phantom, and I think the book had just come out when we met. I was very surprised and pleasantly surprised that you already started reading it. So yeah.
So let's start off with after it's quite close to now. You are at the Gothenburg Book Fair. And got an award for the work. I guess it's mostly for the book, or is it like? So how was that?
Oh, that was a great honor to be recognized for your work. Nothing that you can possibly ever expect when sitting there and spending so many hours, days, weeks, months, years trying to finish a manuscript. So it was really a great honor, and I was the one who introduced me was Pidan Duchon, that you've had as a guest here on the podcast as well. So it felt like a very good connection as well.
Yeah. No, he's a fun guy. Is he as funny in person as what he is with his work and his stories?
No, not at all. He's the most boring person I've ever met. No, he is. He's a lovely guy.
And for some context for those who are not Swedes, this Adamson award, that's a big thing in Sweden. It's like the biggest comic book prize we have. So it's a big thing.
Yeah, no, I feel very very honored, and I'm pleased. I mean, basically, I write predominantly, scientific articles for academic readers, which means that my books usually that don't deal with comics, they usually have like seven readers or something like that, and so I'm very pleasantly surprised, because this is my first book in Swedish, that it has been so widely read and discussed and picked up in various mediums and so on and so forth. So I'm a bit shocked and humbled by the attention and praise that it has received. So yeah, I'm very glad.
Yeah, and that's a good thing you mentioned. Like in Sweden, it was like all the major newspaper did articles about this book, and I mean, it's great for you, but it's also great for Fantomen that it gets more eyes on it here in Sweden. So yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, hopefully some of the people who've read the book or read about the book or consumed other medias that discusses it has drawn their attention to the fact that the Phantom is still being published today, and possibly we'll have to ask Andreas and Jakob if they've seen any impact on subscriptions.
Yeah, that would be cool. Regarding that, do you read any of the modern Phantom comic books that comes out? Or is it mostly the old ones you are interested in?
I do, but not very regularly, I have to admit. I've tried to introduce, for instance, my wife has a son who's 13, and I've tried to previously introduce him to the fandom, to not too much avail, unfortunately. But I occasionally read the later and current issues. But I must admit that my background is that I used to read everything about the Phantom that I could possibly get my hands on as a kid, and probably up to my mid-teens or something like that. And especially those, I don't know if you remember, Mikael, but those, when the Phantom became a little bit more, how should I put it, when it was painted in darker shades during the mid-90s with the election in Bengali and so on and so forth, those type of episodes with that were drawn by Hasse Lindahl. Those were kind of my favorite parts, and I've always also, which been perhaps more fond of a Phantom written by people like Magnus Knutsson and Janne Lundström than by Lee Falk. And I know that by saying this, I probably said the most controversial thing on this podcast in decades, and I assume that quite a few of the Australians listeners will stop listening now.
Look, you're not the first person I've heard admit that. I think Lee Falk, he's not, he made mistakes, and stuff like that. And from an Australian, I love what Lee Falk did, but I also have a deep love for what the Swedes have added to the character. Like the continuity, the adding of depth, and and stuff like that. So look, I'm sure you might have offended some, but I've offended many, and some of them still listen to us, so I wouldn't worry too much.
Fair enough.
Yeah, good thing there's no Falkist in this podcast.
Shout out to Dan. That's the real reason why Dan wasn't involved, is
yeah,
didn't want any Falkers.
So I got a question here. I didn't write this, I think. So the book is called When the Phantom Became Swedish. Right. So what makes him Swedish over Australian or Indian?
Excellent question. So that's correct. The book is called When the Phantom Became Swedish. And the background then that I try to, basically I have a very simple question that I try to answer in this book, and that is what's the reason to why the Phantom has become so popular in Sweden, which may come across as a bit peculiar, since it's an American creation about a white man living in an African jungle, more or less. And there's very little kind of connection to Sweden in it. And at the same time, we need to take into account the fact that Phantom, the comic book, had its kind of its heydays in Sweden. It was when it had its when most people read it was during the 1970s, a period in Swedish history where Sweden as a country also started to position itself as perhaps the most anti-racist and anti-fascist country in the world. And there seems then to be a little bit of a contradiction at the same time, since we all know, and all listeners know, that there has been quite a few of accusations against the Phantom for reproducing a certain kind of colonialist worldview and so on and so forth. So what I do in this book is I started to grapple with and try to come to terms with what is the reason then that the Phantom has become almost a kind of a Swedish hero. It's perhaps the closest thing we got to our own kind of major comic book hero. I mean, when I grew up in Sweden during the 80s and 90s, I mean, we had the Phantom's images of the Phantom on products, similar to the ways in which that if I go into an ordinary store today, I'll see things with products with the Spider-Man on them or Batman and stuff like that, which included soda, sweets, milk, and of course then we had the Phantom World or Fantomenland in Eskilstuna, a theme park devoted to the Phantom. So the answer to this then is that, as we all know, that the Swedish creators that were later on named Team Fantomen started to produce their own Phantom scripts and stories in the early 1970s. And the background to that is, of course, that the Phantom comic books, its sales started to increase during the 1960s, which meant that Semik Press, the owner of the company, or owner of the comic book, wanted to increase the publishing rate to every 2 weeks from a monthly print run. And also the fact that during the 60s in Sweden, the Phantom, there was also a strong debate in the cultural section in the dailies about the content in comic books and children's literature, and the Phantom had to was heavily criticized for being a fascist and imperialist. I mean, this is also part of the kind of how the political landscape during the 1960s started to gear towards a more leftist perspective. And so these Swedish creators, they're also part of this kind of leftist movement. They started to make some radical changes to the Phantom's universe. And what we can see in these episodes that they started to produce during the 70s is that it's the scripts are not only produced in Sweden, but in the actual scripts we see kind of a heavy dose of Sweden in them, and especially issues, political leanings, and so on and so forth that were dominant during that period of time. So that's a kind of a short answer to why the Phantom became Swedish at this point in history.
Yeah, a great answer. I got like tons of follow-up questions on that. But yeah, so first off, basically now they are since like 5-6 years ago, Fru started making their own Phantom stories. Do you think we could see like a book saying when the Phantom became Australian then? If they put in lots of Australian politicians, politics and agendas?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps, but I have read too few Australian scripts to be able to comment on that. However, this is, of course, always a little bit tricky to explain, but for Scandinavian listeners predominantly, and for you and me, Mikael, we are both kind of quite aware of that. The 1970s, the early 1970s and the late 1960s. I mean, they were very kind of particular times in history with kind of a strong leaning towards the left, where a kind of a leftist perspective on ideology has had kind of conquered the privilege to kind of define problems, which meant that they were able to provide kind of were able to bring forward what they saw as the kind of key issues that needed to be addressed in society, and also in a sense made all parties, regardless of their own political leanings from left to right, that they had to kind of follow suit slightly, in a which is similar to a sense that from the 1980s, for instance, we saw a backlash where kind of a more of a liberal agenda started to kind of conquer the same kind of privilege of being able to kind of define what are the major problems in society, and which is also something that we see perhaps even more strongly now, and perhaps even more to the right, as we've just had a new government elected in Sweden. But I guess that's not perhaps very interesting to anyone but Swedish listeners.
So I just wanted to quickly jump in. In a minute or two, what are some brief leanings that we did see in these stories? Like, could you just list a couple of, just
definitely.
For those who haven't listened to episode 101, who haven't read your book, just they might be curious if you could just give us a bit of a quick recap.
Yeah, definitely. So what happens is that first of all, these Swedish episodes introduce the Phantom to a new set of villains. This is when for the first time, when, for instance, the Stevens family appear. I don't know if the Stevens family are familiar to Australian readers.
I think there might be one story where it mentions one, but majority of them are fairly unknown.
Fair enough. So the Stevens family are kind of an embodiment of the kind of white colonial bourgeoisie in Bengali or Bangala. And what they do is that this family, they used to be, or they are still, a kind of a major land owning family whose richness can be traced back to when Bangala was a colony, basically. So it's despite the fact that Bengala is now a kind of a democratic country, it's still this kind of white colonial elite that still controls much of the natural resources and land in the country in the Swedish episodes, which is of course also a topic that's heavily discussed in Swedish society at this time. So the Phantom has to deal with this kind of colonial elite, and what he wants to do is to ensure that, for instance, natural resources are owned collectively by the state, basically. And a new thing then is that he doesn't necessarily uses his fists or violence in the same manner. Rather, he tries to twist the arm of this elite in society to ensure that the fragile kind of state in a kind of a post-colonial nation state in Africa are able to get control of these kind of natural resources. That's one example. Another is the fact that, sorry, Mikael.
Yeah, I was just chiming in that he basically uses the same methods as they do. He make them sign contracts that they don't really want to do to be able to, that what, please continue.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he does. Another example is that, for instance, that they create rådja, which these creators, Janne Lundström, Magnus Knutsson, Ulf Granberg, considered to be the their kind of most radical initiative. Rhodia is this small apartheid nation that neighbors Bengali, which enables the Phantom to start fighting against basically apartheid, which is a huge topic at this point in time in Swedish in Swedish public debate. We have several kind of prominent writers that discusses their experience from South Africa and Rhodesia. The Swedish government start to collaborate heavily with these kind of liberation movements in Southern Africa and so on and so forth. 1968, protesters stop a match of tennis between Sweden and Rhodesia and so on and so forth. So it's a very heavy topic, and what happens is basically that the Phantom starts to be involved as well. In order to what he does is that he supplies weapons to liberation movements that fights against the white elite in Rhodia, and he also helps them make use of their weapons to destroy important kind of targets in Rhodia and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of a very shining examples. And interesting here is also that they use Rhodia as a way to criticize Lee Falk, because Janne Lundström says in the letter pages that Lee Falk would never dare to do what we do here. Wants this to be a kind of example of how much more progressive Swedish and daring the Swedish editors and Swedish society is at that time in comparison to the US. Another example is, of course, that these environmental themes are introduced as well into the Phantom's universe. He's starting to discuss gender equality, which is part of Diana in the Jungle Patrol, that I think is familiar also to Australian readers.
Should be. We've all got the card game, so
yeah, fair enough. Another example is that we mentioned earlier is the trade war, which is basically the Phantoms, where the Phantom helps black peasants to protect their economic interests by teaching them the underpinning idea of a cooperative society, which is also something that the Swedish foreign aid at this time heavily promoted in various parts of Africa at the same time, and so on and so forth. So there are several examples, but we'll probably get back to those.
Yeah, wow. So what's interesting is Rhodia has actually found its way into the newspaper universe, for the lack of a better term, and is still being used by Tony DePaul now. So that's a very good example of that coming into the newspaper universe. So
yeah, and they've also been published in Swedish later on, those by Tony DePaul, and I think it's fascinating to see how these inventions are being kind of incorporated into the Phantom universe later on. Although one could also at the same time say that it's perhaps less controversial now than it was back in 1972 and so forth.
Yeah, definitely. So I've got a question. I hope you don't mind, Mikael. Is, do we still have politicism in today's comic? And I guess this is a question for all of us. Can you see it in the comic today? Like the one I can see, yeah. If you think you can, because it'll be interesting. Because we're talking, 70s, 80s here. That's some of us weren't even alive back then. So, but it's just curious to see whether you still think there's politicism injected in today's comic.
Well, I mean, I think Mikael is in a better position answer this one, but I just want to clarify something, and that is that sometimes I see a reaction when it comes to comic books that, you know, people say that, you know, there shouldn't be any politics. There's no place in politics of politics in comics, and that makes comic come across as a kind of a political kind of artifact, which they aren't, of course. I mean, when for instance, Team Fantomen started to kind of speak about these issues, about making the Phantom kind of more of an anti-racist symbol or tackling gender equality, of course, they inject a certain political view into the comic books, and perhaps they do it in a very, I should put it, in a very obvious fashion. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that, I mean, Lee Falk's Phantom scripts were, of course, also heavily politicized, but in another way, in that sense that what they did was that basically that they didn't agree with the position that Lee Falk, consciously or unconsciously, positioned himself when he dealt with questions around gender in the Phantom's universe, and they wanted to kind of do something else. The same thing with the kind of anti-racist position. I mean, Lee Falk, gradually throughout the publishing history changed many things, of course, in the Phantom's universe, and in keeping with the times and social mores, gradually altered various parts of the Phantom universe. But that was also, of course, a kind of a political position, and perhaps he was more, he wasn't as conscious about it as these Swedish scriptwriters were. But what they did, of course, it was full of politics, but in a different way. And what they did was that the Swedish ones was that they kind of brought in another political perspective. Of course, I mean, for instance, as an example, then, Lee Falk's constant use of these kind of tropes from the kind of colonial literature that he borrowed heavily from is, of course, very much a kind of a political statement in itself. But perhaps he just considered it as a way to kind of create fascinating and entertaining adventures. I mean, it could be just a kind of an unconscious decision on his behalf, but it was still political. I mean, the Phantom has never been a kind of a neutral character.
What do you think, Mikael? Do you think the politicism's still in today's comic?
I think it is, but it's, at least in Sweden, it's very much in line with what is the norm of political view. It's a lot of easy points, I would say. It's seldom a moral dilemma. It's more of, but I also think, like, I remember when reading the book and thinking of many of these stories, it could be just like some lines sometimes that you take up that is like the political view, but the main story is the regular, oh, there's a poacher, I go take care of him, and then they say something, oh, they come here and take
our land and our resources.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be a lot in a story, and if you read it in looking for the political views, then you will find it, but maybe if you don't, you would just gloss over it. Like, I think a big thing was this when you had Mikael over, and you talked about this Golden Eagle story with the, and from my understanding is that he never thought it would be a big thing that he what's it called, defends a lot of pride people, but there became this big thing in Sweden, at least, where they were like, oh, stop being politics in Fantomen. And that's the same thing. Like, if you just say, oh, but he defends those in need, doesn't matter. It's there if you look for it, and you might not see it if you don't look for it.
You raised a good point. There was a lot of, because that's something that happened in, our lifetime, if you know what I mean. So, I was there when the Phantom world stopped in a sense, because there was a picture of him hitting a bad guy with a flag. Was there as much outcry back in the 70s when these other stories were going on like there was today when the Phantom hit someone with a flag? Now, I understand with social media and Facebook, everyone's now got a microphone, and where back in the day you actually had to write a letter to be heard by the editors. But I guess it's probably for both of you. You've both got the comics. You've probably read the letters to the publishers and the editors. Was there much outcry from the regular Joe or the regular Mikael reader?
I haven't read that many of those letters, so I don't know actually. Do you know, Robert?
Yeah, well, I mean, what happens during the 1970s? The general position is quite often that readers write in to complain regarding what they dislike about the episodes. And it's usually the fact that they don't think that the Phantom is progressive enough, basically. And there are several examples of this. Sometimes it can also be that they don't like the ways in which an American episode by Lee Falk, how it has been translated, for instance, the fact that there may be something slightly sexist in Lee Falk's episode, and they critique the fact that the editor hasn't picked this up and kind of changed it. So I've included a few of these examples in the book as well.
So you're saying that there was a lot of, so you're saying that there was actually the readers that were saying to the editors, hang on, this is wrong. Why wasn't it changed?
Yeah, exactly. And
wow.
you have examples of, for instance, of Ulf Granberg apologizing for that they should have kind of picked this up, of course. And then at the same time, you also have basically, during the early 70s, you have journalists who write to engage in a debate with people like Janne Lundström and Magnus Knutsson, who are a little bit at the forefront for this kind of radical makeover of the Phantom. And they have conversations about the content in the Phantom. And this puts Janne Lundström and Magnus Knutsson in a little bit of a difficult position, because, what they've done is that they've made these kind of quite radical changes to the Phantom's universe, but for several critics at the time, it's not enough. And the thing is, of course, that, they can't do too much with the Phantom, because, you have to keep the kind of the basic premise, which is that, he is this person living in Bengali and so on and so forth, and may still be a little bit of a white savior, which is a classical trope in colonial literature. But so there you still have this debate, but Lundström and Knutsson, they engage in these discussions and try to point out things that they've done with the character and so forth. So it's quite a fruitful debate. But you still have kind of conversations going on in the newspapers, where people write, for instance. I also have several examples of this in the book, where you have in the dailies where a critic can say, well, now the Phantom has done this and that, which is of course much more progressive. However, I would have liked the character to go even further, and so on and so forth. They're a little bit caught between a rock and a hard place, these scriptwriters.
Random question. This is from someone who is intrigued by the argument, I guess you could call it, or the debate between the newspaper journalists and Magnus and Jan. Is there any chance of maybe getting an English translation of that? Because I reckon that will be really intriguing to read.
Yeah, I'll see what I what I can do. It's I mean, the question is usually around time, which is something that I have a limited amount of. But I'll see what if it's not in a rush, I'll see what I can do. And I mean, perhaps if through our listening, this could perhaps be an interesting content for a kind of an introduction or something like that. If they want to do, I don't know, a comic that includes a few of these episodes.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to be able to. It'll be mind-boggling to be able to to be able to read it and that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it adds some, an additional dimension, of course. Yeah. So yeah, this is a very interesting kind of source material as well. But having said that, a lot of these kind of letter pages in the Phantom during the 1970s, as you said earlier, that was before social media. So these kind of letter pages, they are also a kind of a certain kind of historic version of social media, where people just write about their favorite food and why this or that pop band are good or bad, and whatever.
Lots of records also. I could make eat a sandwich that was 10 loaves high or something.
yeah exactly.
Quite weird. Yeah, there's a certain type of people when you talk about being into the Phantom that basically has this view, maybe haven't even read the Phantom, or they have read a little bit, and they have this view of the white savior. And I feel like it has changed over the years to become something different. But I mean, is there a way to really, like you were saying, how much can you change without it being something else? And can we ever do something to point that he's not a white savior anymore?
That's a really tricky, large question. But I mean, I think you're right in the sense that, I mean, there are, for instance, there's a British professor called Will Brooker who researches popular culture, who did a dissertation about the Batman. And what's interesting about his dissertation, I think, is that what he tries to grapple with or come to terms with is that how many Batman are there? Because, I mean, given the fact that the Batman has had so many different writers and artists and creators and kind of incarnations, and during his long history, I mean, it's very hard to pinpoint, according to Brooker, who is Batman. And perhaps it's the same thing with the Phantom. There has been so many incarnations of the Phantom. He's written by so many different people and so on and so forth. So I presume that, for instance, Tony DePaul may have a slightly different understanding of who the Phantom is than, let's say, Pid Andersson or Andreas Eriksson and so on and so forth. And perhaps their Phantom is a little bit different from Lee Falk's and Janne Lundström's kind of understanding of the Phantom. And of course, I mean, perhaps there's a new Phantom for every era, and which means that today's Phantom, presumably, and from what I've seen, has very little to do with the Phantom from dating back to the 1950s, when perhaps the kind of this white savior idea was very kind of striking in at least Lee Falk's writing.
And I think that's a very good point. And the comparison to like Batman or Spider-Man, all those DC and Marvel heroes, they have real reboots. Like they say, now the universe stops and we start over, and they do all the things again, but in a slightly different ways. The Phantom never has that. It is basically the same as, what is it, 87, 86 years ago, and it's just ongoing. And as you say, there has been very much changes. If you look at a comic from the 50s and one now, you wouldn't see that many similarities, but there hasn't been like an official, oh, let's skip everything that's happened and we start over and just tell it the way we want to. And I think that might be a reason why it's hard to make the Phantom popular. There's just so much background to get into, and some of it is like, yeah, you should focus on this part of the stories, and this you can skip, and then you should focus instead of like a reboot and doing all the important things again. That was a sidetrack. It wasn't hadn't do anything with this white savior thing, but needed to get it out of my system.
Because the thing I have with the white savior is, I reckon it's probably one of the main reasons why we have not seen a new movie or TV shows, type of thing. Obviously, it's not DC Marvel, so there's not as much money behind it, but I look at something like, say, even Tarzan, like there was a new Tarzan movie that was recently announced that was going to happen. And every second article about Tarzan was about the white savior complex and how they're going to battle that and stuff like that. And I think sometimes, especially with social media, they kind of go, oh yeah, let's do a Phantom. Oh no, I could just see what the news articles are going to be, the reports are. Let's just put it back in the too hard basket. So I was just curious on if you had the silver bullet to be able to conquer the white savior problem.
That's a really, really tough question to answer, because I think it will be inevitable, of course, that those type of discussions will resurface, similar to the ways in which they resurface every time there's a new Tarzan movie, and perhaps for good reason. However, as we've discussed here today, perhaps there are so many incarnations of the Phantom. So, I mean, you could perhaps also make the case that a new the Phantom movie will, of course, have a certain shade of white savior, but it can also be a Phantom that addresses questions of pollution, racism, gender discrimination, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are so many kind of issues that the Phantom has dealt with in a way that it's much more progressive than you're able to find in other comic books of the same period. For instance, I mean, if you compare the content of the Phantom comics that or the storylines produced by, for instance, Team Fantomen and predominantly Magnus Knutson and Janne Lundström, it's so much more progressive than what you find in other examples of kind of new left ideology, as kind of that run of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, which is kind of usually praised as kind of a great example of how comic book heroes start to deal with questions with more kind of social relevance. And I think that the Phantom is miles ahead of that title, but less recognized, perhaps simply because of the fact that it's the Phantom. It doesn't have the same kind of, how should I put it, global appeal as a comic book produced by DC Comics. At the same time, I mean, this is also the fact. Another fact is, of course, that the Green Arrow and Green Lantern sold very poorly, which is the reason why they cancelled it quite soon. It's just been kind of a narrative around it, which has been created later on about how popular that storyline actually was. Meanwhile, the Phantom sold, at least in Sweden, in kind of incredible volumes at that period in time.
Yeah, I really find it interesting when you're comparing Magnus, Ulf, and Jan to Lee Falk about how more progressive they were, because what I find interesting is when you're talking to especially Americans who don't know so much about the Swedish influence, when they're comparing, say, Lee Falk to his US counterparts, they talk about how well progressed Lee Falk was compared to them. But then, in talking to you, you're then comparing Lee Falk to these guys, and then I just find it very interesting about, because a lot of people see Lee Falk as progressive, but from a Swedish point of view, from that time, he wasn't actually progressive at all. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, Janne Lundström and Magnus Knutsson, when I interviewed them, they told me that they were a little bit nervous when Lee Falk flew in to Stockholm for a visit early in 1970s, and they went out for dinner. And Janne and Magnus then had this idea that they were going to tell Lee Falk about their plans for his creation. And according to both of them, Lee Falk was very positive about their initiatives to have, for instance, the Phantom fighting against apartheid and so on and so forth. So they both kind of consider him to be, very much of a liberal on a kind of on the American political scale. And also, although, for instance, Janne Lundström have kind of criticized Lee Falk for not being as progressive, he has also kind of cautioned his critique by saying that, the reason to this could, of course, also be that he was scared that readers back in the US would stop reading the Phantom if he included too many kind of sensitive topics. I mean, we need to take in consideration the fact that, for instance, apartheid was a sensitive issue, given the fact that legal rights between blacks and whites in southern parts of the United States at that period of time was something very recent. So I mean, I think it's important also to take into the kind of political landscape in which these various scriptwriters operated in.
Yeah, there's a famous story about when Lee Falk was doing a play, one of the leads was African American, and they were at a restaurant, and the restaurant wouldn't serve one of the African American actors, and so he basically got up, took everyone, and then went to another restaurant. So you hear stories like that. When compared to US creators, he was ahead of his time. And then with that story with Magnus and Jan, that's it kind of adds to that belief.
Yeah, of course. At the same time, I think that Lee Falk, did himself a little bit of a disfavor by being so sensitive about this topic, that he was never able to kind of admit that what so many other people actually saw in his predominantly in his early manuscripts about about this kind of white savior and the kind of the racist dimensions of them. I think that if he would have just come clean about it and said that I was a product of my time, now I can see more clearly, and I like to kind of to readdress this and so on and so forth. I think that would have put him in a better position than simply constantly trying to his admittance has only been to that storyline about
the Phantom goes to war.
Exactly, about the Japanese.
There has been an interview where he's regretted being so, I guess, racist in that story.
Yeah, so, and even though he doesn't say anything about the other things, you could clearly see change in the 60s, 70s in Lee Falk stories as well. Like, he made it a republic, he made a black president, a black leader of Jungle Patrol, and he tried to do it better, even though he didn't maybe admit of doing it bad before.
Exactly. And that's very apparent, all these changes that he does, and also, for instance, to make Bengali, to transform Bengali into a post-colonial nation during the 1960s, as these kind of developments were occurring outside the comic pages as well. I think that's a very good proof of the fact that he was trying to make these kind of developments in line with what was going on outside the what's going on at the same time in various parts of Africa.
And regarding to that, with that the Swedes was was more progressive, how come we never changed the name of Bengali and Morristown to Bengala and Mavitan as they did in the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you know the answer to that one better than I, because it's been a kind of I remember when I read The Phantom as a kid, there was always kind of questions about that as well. I don't remember when this was changed in the American scripts. Do you know?
I believe, and this is actually because I've had this conversation with someone, might have even been you, Mikael. I believe it was the late 60s, early 70s.
And from what I remember, I might misremember, but what I remember was Ulf Granberg basically saying that it was too well known in
established,
Sweden, too well established, that they didn't want to change it. But I still wanted to throw out the question.
I think it's a very good example, and I don't know if you remember this, Mikael, but in the book I also show other examples of where the Swedish scriptwriters are perhaps less successful with trying to make kind of a progressive statement in the Phantom's universe. There are also examples when they fall into the same trap that both I and them criticize Lee Falk for. The kind of use of these slightly colonial tropes. There are a few episodes when the Swedish scriptwriters, including, for instance, Janne Lundström, also kind of fall back on these. So it's.
Do you have examples that you could quickly tell us? Top of your head.
I can't remember of the storylines in. I can't remember the storylines in the name of them in Swedish, which makes it harder to translate them into to English. But I show, for instance, an example where the Phantom has to rescue a woman from a cannibal's pot, and then there's also another example of where I can't, it's from an early episode from the early 1970s when the Phantom I can't remember which one it is. It's the one. Do you remember, Mikael? You probably read it more recently than I did, but it's one of the episodes where it's called. I think it's called the water test in English. It's an episode where the Phantom, for some reason, has to save a certain person in one of these in a neighboring country, and what he has to do then is to replace. I shouldn't say too much. I have to double check the episode again, but this could be part of the Patreon exclusive part of the interview where I provide some information about this particular episode. But at the same time,
I'm just looking at Phantom Wiki. There was a story in Phantom 26, 1970 by Jan Landstrom and Bertil Williamson called The Water Test, but I'm not sure if
that's the one that I was thinking about, and I'll have to
that hasn't yet been published in Australia.
I don't think there's any reason to publish it either. I'm just I only wanted to bring up an example of that, as all of us, even though you have certain kind of a political leaning, a commitment. I mean, it's very difficult to be. I mean, when you produce so many storylines, that I mean, there are always these kind of traps that you fall into, and I wanted just to explain or point to the fact that this, of course, also kind of happens to these. I mean, Swedish script writers, that there are certain kind of themes and tropes that of course can be criticized for being less progressive. Let's put it that way. At the same time, sorry.
I think you took up as an example with the Princess Sin story with the exploitation.
Could you show us that image again? Sorry. Oh, did you just close it? I was just pinning you on the chat, so everyone, if you're on YouTube, you'll be able to see it.
Not. Yeah, something like that. With the exploitation of women and.
Yeah, that's of course another good example, and that is, I mean, but that follows the kind of a broader logic in society, and that is that for instance, in one of these kind of most influential kind of political texts at the time, which is called A New Left, basically, which kind of gives away, I mean, what's at stake here. These kind of very prominent authors who are, who makes the perhaps the most ambitious effort to launch the New Left in a Swedish context. I mean, they say already in the late 60s that when it comes to issues regarding gender equality, much has already been done, so we have to focus on, put our attention to other issues, which is of course something that these kind of women's movements and so on and so forth during the 1970s are heavily critical of. And Magnus Knutsson, when he does this storyline Diana in the Jungle Patrol, he said himself that he was inspired by the message of these feminist movements at the time. However, I mean, storylines that discusses issues around kind of anti-racism or kind of colonial legacies in the Phantom's world, part of the world, or where the Phantom goes up against kind of these kind of the colonial elite and multinational companies and so on and so forth. I mean, they are, in terms of quantitatives, I mean, there are plenty of these type of episodes, but when it comes to storylines that deals with kind of gender equality, it's more or less only Diana in the Jungle Patrol. There are very few, and just a few years later, when we start to approach early 1980s, we see that the introductions of these type of more kind of, how should I put it, less progressive female examples, such as this new villain, Princess Sin, whose tactic is to try and seduce the Phantom by constantly removing her clothes every time she sees the Phantom. And I think I don't have to go into details for our readers about how problematic this is for a comic book done that if it's serious about questions of gender equality.
So it's worth noting that storyline has recently been printed in Australia, including in a trade paperback with a new sequel and prequel story as well.
Right.
So I think there's another one. There's another character. Is it Vista Robita or
Vista Ribby?
Yeah, she seems to be kind of like what's the best? Kind of like a real strong female lead who's like a bad person, similar, kind of like a Sala type of, Sala, Lady Luck Pirates type of version as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think they did a good storyline with Miss Mist. That's a strong female lead that doesn't use her sexuality, and I really like that storyline.
Has there been any stories, I guess in both, this is a question from an Australian to both of you, is there any stories from this era touching upon these themes that Frew have not yet published that, in your opinions, they should publish?
That's super hard. I mean, it's hard to know everything you have published and all. But I remember, like, before this, you had a reading list, right? And it was like missing half of the stories or something like that. But you have, Frew has taken a lot of these old ones and published them lately.
Yes.
And I guess they have to look at the sales of those comic book if they want to. I think there's a lot more they can take from if they want.
Yeah. And like, for instance, on the last podcast, we talked about the slaves, the trade war. I think there was one or two more. The Dead River, I think it was as well. So like they were key ones, I guess, introduced, because that was when we were first introduced to Rhodia, when we were first introduced to the RLA, the Rhodesian Liberation Army. We've got the central theme about the trading post becoming a community or a communal trading post. I was just curious if there's any other key stories like that we have missed so far. I know that's a question without notice. So,
well, I think those those storylines that we discussed a couple of years ago when I was when we last met, I think they give. They're a very good kind of introduction to the broader themes that are central to Team Fantomen's universe at this point in time. Then, of course, I would have to kind of recheck the list of all the episodes that I provided you with to see which ones could be of interest. But it's I think there are two. There are two things to keep in mind. One is that, for instance, an episode such as the trade war about this kind of cooperative society. I mean, Janne Lundström is my kind of favorite, is one of my kind of all-time favorites, not only for what he did with the Phantom, but also with Johan Wilde and so on and so forth. So I hold him in very high esteem. But I wouldn't say that the Trade War is necessarily, how should I put it, his best work, because it's an adventure that tries to kind of promote an idea rather than perhaps being kind of very entertaining. So I think that for an Australian reader, it must come across as a little bit of an
propaganda,
peculiar reading, because it's so much a product of its time. I mean, it's a little bit of a comic book version of a newspaper article or a debate that is ongoing at that period of time in Swedish history. And if you don't have that context, it must be, a little bit of a dull reading, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you want to do that, I mean, when it comes to these episodes, perhaps one have to check out the kind of general entertainment value and the general quality, but then also perhaps the subtext of, how kind of representative are these for this period in history. So, for instance, perhaps. I think Mikael is right. We probably need to look at their how much they've sold these comics. But if you put them together in one comic book, for instance, or collect a few of them, it could be, of course, a very kind of interesting text, both to read as entertainment, but also to get, for an Australian reader, get a broader understanding of where does the Swedish scripts come from, basically. And also I find them to be really interesting to read in relation to other comic book heroes that we mentioned earlier from Marvel and DC, to actually see how progressive a comic book character can be. So yeah. Sorry for that long.
No. It's it's great. I guess a follow-up question is, we talked about them being published by Frew. Have these stories been published much by Fantomen? Mikael, you're probably best to answer that one.
Yeah, I remember most prominent is that they had this when the Fantomen Krönika was still a thing. They had this that called the 70s, and they had one for Ulf, and they had one for Janne, I think. And it's like, but that is quite a few years ago. And like in the regular comic book, a few years ago, they started doing like from the beginning almost with all the Öskanieralp and all the Bertil Wilhelmsson stories, but they have not really come to those in a long. I don't think most of them has ever been reprinted more than in the Krönika for like 15 years ago or something.
Yeah. Now, I guess like some of the stories like Diana in the Jungle Patrol, that probably still stands up as a story that could be read today. Like it's actually a decent story. It's
and that one was actually reprinted last year or the year before, right?
Yeah. And then also a couple of years before for Frew as well. So and then of course with your card game as well, Mikael.
Yeah, I think that was why they reprinted it. Nah.
And I think the Dead River was republished like 10 years ago or something like that in color. Like
No, it's just interesting. I'm sure our listeners are as well, but I can only speak for myself. But I find it really interesting learning more about the culture of the Swedes back in the 70s and how that drove the direction of where the Phantom was. And then, I found it interesting, the story about Magnus and Jan meeting Lee Falk, Lee Falk being happy with the direction that they were taking, and then also how the readers were holding the editors accountable as well. It's just, it's really fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I've really enjoyed it. Mikael, you got any other questions you wanted to ask or anything else?
It has been a pleasure, but no more questions.
Robert, is there anything that we might have missed, or any points you wouldn't mind that you wanted to discuss before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think we've touched upon a few of the key issues here, and I'm certain that those listeners who've listened to a previous podcast that I've been part of, but also those with Swedish with Swedish scriptwriters and editors are slightly familiar with what we've touched upon here today. So I hopefully they've enjoyed it, and my apologies that the book is only available in Swedish.
No worries. Well, the other book is in English, which was your first one. Now, we'll have links on how people can buy it, which I'm assuming is via our website. So we'll get those off you, Robert, so we can include those in the show notes and in the article, along with the list of stories that you reference as well. And then we'll also put links to our podcast interview with Magnus. I'm just trying to think who else we talked about. Our past podcast with you. I think from memory, Leonard Moberg talks a lot about some of the stuff that we've talked about as well. So we'll include a link to that as well. Haven't been able to get Jan Lundstrom on the podcast yet. So hopefully we can get him on as well.
I was just going to suggest that. Have you been in contact with him?
I think it was Mikael that tried doing it for us. Was it you, Mikael?
No.
But we'd love to be able to get him on. So if you've got any pull in that area, Robert, would love to.
Well, I met him. When was it? Just a few days ago. We had lunch because I was in Malmö for a conference, and Jan Lundström is a lovely guy, and we were discussing. I'm very glad that he's very fond of the book, and we were also discussing that the possibility that, because I've done a few book talks about the book, and whenever I'm down south, that he was going to. The plan is that he will be present during those book talks, that we can have a dialogue or a chat about the book together. I mean, he is living history. But yeah, I'll put in a good word for you too, and hopefully I'll be able to convince him. But we can do that off air.
Yeah, no, that will be amazing. So thank you, Mikael. Thank you for running the podcast today. I hope you enjoyed that. Did a great job. Robert, thank you for joining us. Listeners, thank you for joining us as well. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was fascinating for you, that you learned something new about the history of the character, that from Sweden, but that has actually permeated and influenced the Phantom in a whole. We talked about it like with Rhodia, which is now in, for instance, that creation, which was a reflection of the times and of a certain country or two back in those days, has actually become mainstream across all Phantom universes, for the lack of a better term. A reminder note that we have a signed book by Robert, which will be our Christmas Patreon Hang on, quickly, Mikael, show us again. There it is. There.
Can I throw in an additional copy then of the book to what should we say, the first new Patreon subscriber or something like that?
Okay. Yes. All right. There you go. So Robert Aman's also going to throw in a signed book for our next Patreon sign up. So once this podcast is released, the first person who signs up will get a free copy of that, and we'll get that shipped off to you free of charge as well. So thank you for that, Robert.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll post it myself. Unfortunately, though, I mean the book is in Swedish, but it contains a lot of images at least. Let's inform that first new Patreon subscriber that if they want the book, please forward their address to where it's going to be shipped, and I'll get it done as soon as possible.
That sounds amazing. Thank you for that. So if you have any ideas or of creators or ideas for podcasts that you would like to see interviewed or touched upon, please contact us. You can contact us on our website, which is chroniclechamber.com, our email address, which is chroniclechamber@gmail.com. If you want to be notified of new articles, ensure you follow us either on our social media platforms, which is Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or you can sign up with your email address on our website and you'll be emailed as soon as something new is posted on our website, which includes reviews from comics from around the world, podcast, and latest news as well. You can subscribe to us via YouTube or through your favorite podcast app, including iTunes and Spotify. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you had fun. Hope you learned something new. From myself, thank you. Happy Phantoming. Mikael, Robert, you guys are legends. Thank you. Happy Phantoming.
Happy Phantoming.
Happy Phantoming.
The ghost who walks. Enemies beware. The Phantom's always there, but you won't mind the Phantom.